John D. Sheridan's writings have wit and style and are delightfully written. It's only when you read them aloud that you'll appreciate his sheer sense of fun. But better than that, he writes for all of us and about all of us, and he never hurts because he has so much sympathy and compassion. So here's a salute then to a fine man of letters, and it's a pleasure and an honor to have been invited to make these recordings. These sea-girt islands of ours have a climate that looks quite well in textbooks and tourist brochures, but whilst the geographers describe it as temperate, the natives, who know it better, describe it as bronical, and with good reason, for they suffer for 9 months out of the 12 from a complaint which gives endless food for discussion, advice, and prognosis, and is referred to as the old chest. The old chest is fatal, but in a benign and leisurely way. It gets us all in the end, but not before we're practically dead from something else, so that most of us manage to cough our way well into the 70s, while those who go sooner are regarded as having been cut off in the first flush of youth. And in the meantime, life is made very pleasant by immense quantities of hot punch. In Ireland, our chief indoor sport is coughing, which is also known as clearing the old chest, and our best coughing is done in the early morning. We cough before we get up, we cough when we're getting up, and we cough to show that we are up. And each time we stop to draw breath, we hear the man next door practicing his arpeggios. The morning cough, when heard at its richest, has 2 distinct notes. There is the heroic note, which tells a cold and heedless world that we're determined to struggle on. And there is the despairing note, which tells the rest of the household that we haven't much time left for coughing, and that in a really Christian community we'd be sent back to die in our beds. The morning cough, though basically involuntary, can be modified and prolonged at the will of the performer, and there are as many coughs as there are coughers. A cough is as distinctive as a signature, so that a trained ear can tell when there are strangers in church and recognize passers-by by their whinnies. The street cough and the church cough, however, are marked by restraint, and it's only under his own roof that a man can really let himself go. The house cough has a solid bass and a clearly marked rhythm. It is built to a pattern, like a sonata, and it has a definite sequence of movements. A really good house cough, too, is not only vocal, but articulate, so it can express grumbles and maledictions and fears of approaching dissolution. Indeed, in some of the remoter parts of the country, coughing largely replaces conversation, from the first snowfall to the first crocus. Among the commoner coughs heard in these temperate latitudes are the dog growl, the death rattle, the slow strangulation, and the "another clean shirt'll do me." But these are only rough classifications, for there are endless variations in tone, colour, and pitch, and no 2 coughs are alike. Some start like far-away thunders, others are as sudden as a puncture. Some finish cleanly on a sustained chord, others die away in an arbitrary postscript of clucking hen runs. The real art of the morning cough is to give the impression that you're in extremis, and that somebody should go at once for the priest. It is bad technique to cough continuously, for this shows that you're still alive. You must always contrive spaced silences, during which the family can listen for the sound of your head hitting the edge of the bath. The feeling of crisis would be heightened if you moan from time to time and talk throatily to yourself, as in This will make it seem that you're struggling to make a verbal will and declaring with your last breath that Elizabeth is to get the piano. Coughing in the bathroom is always very effective, as the acoustics are usually good there. If you cough until you shake like the harness on a hearse, you're almost sure to be heard in the kitchen, and your wife will wonder if it's worthwhile putting on your egg or not. A good spell of bathroom coughing fits a man for the ordeal of shaving, and when he's made adequate comment on life and living, he can draw his razor without flinching across the fleshy pockets under his chin. Bathroom coughing puts a man in fine fettle. It clears the head, eases the old chest, tones up the system, and gets the blood into circulation. He breathes deeply and draws cold air into his lungs. He might even burst into song, did he not know that in our climate It's dangerous to sing in the bathroom until you've left off your winter woolens. From the health point of view, coughing is as good as physical jerks, and much less tiring. Indeed, it's one of the few forms of strenuous exercise that sedentary, bulging men are fit for before they get a poultice of porridge into them. In the office, coughing should be done discreetly. You must cough enough to let the others know that you're a hero to come in at all, but continued paroxysms might lead to your being retired on a disability pension. Small seizures, however, will help you to gather your wits when you're asked awkward questions. They're also useful when you have to reprimand subordinates, and they give a knee-shaking quality to... I've had to speak to you before about your timekeeping, Smithers, haven't I? And you are aware, I presume, that this is not a rest home. Evening coughs should not be squandered, but should be conserved like ammunition. Timely bursts are advisable when there's any mention of bringing in coal for the fire or going to a whist drive, but they shouldn't be overdone. You never know when one of the lads might ring up and ask you round for a game of poker. It is well to brisk things up shortly before bedtime, however, lest your restraint should create an impression of vigorous health. And after a really convincing bout, you should mutter brokenly that if you are to be fit for business in the morning, you'd better take something for the old chest. All in all, then, our bronical climate has much to recommend it, and the fact that it tends to shorten life slightly rather than prolong it almost indefinitely is due solely to economic circumstances. Or I might put it another way and say that the only thing that cuts down our supply of centenarians is the unconscionably high price of good whiskey. On the one and only occasion on which I was guilty of housebreaking and larceny, I was incited and briefed, aided and abetted by a member of the Dublin Metropolitan Police. The force, as it was called, had a deservedly high reputation, but for once it was an accessory before the fact. It was 2 days before Christmas, and the last of our 4 turkeys had just arrived. They came, separately, from relatives in the country, each of whom thought that he was the sole donor of our Christmas dinner, and they were hung on arrival on nails behind the door of a dark cubbyhole known as Under the Stairs. Sometimes you forgot that they were there, and when you opened the door to steal an apple or a handful of raisins, the 4 turkeys would swing as frighteningly as corpses on a gibbet. But we didn't forget very often. Having 4 turkeys in the house gave us, temporarily, a higher social standing than the rest of the children in the neighbourhood, and we made the most of it while it lasted. We had conducted tours to the cubbyhole, and the curious and incredulous paid up in bull's eyes and nutty favours. The coming of the turkeys was our December calendar. Once the last of them had come, there was no doubt at all about Christmas, and you knifed the last pennies out of your red savings box. Our turkey morgue had the status of a Madame Tussauds, the stubby red dewlaps of the birds, their pathetic tail feathers that were used afterwards as household dusters, and the tiny bad-tempered beaks that looked as if they might stab and nip at any minute. All these things horrified and delighted us at once. Coarse, blue-white turkey flesh was on the menu of all my childhood nightmares, and when I learned years afterwards that cold turkey means dead as mutton, I saw the aptness of the metaphor at once. We boasted quite a lot about our 4 turkeys, and on this particular day, being short of a child audience, I boasted to the policeman at the corner of the next street. I told him that we had hundreds and hundreds of aunts and uncles in the country, and that they sent us 4 turkeys every year. The policeman put his mittened hands behind his back, rocked on his heels, and looked down at me over his strapped chin. 4, he said, is too many. You'll never eat all of them.
We'll eat one on Christmas Day, I said, and another one on Sunday.
Even so, he said, you'll need help with the other 2. So if you bring one of them down to me here now, I'll eat it for you.
As well as your own, I said.
Divil a one of me own I have, he said.
Now, I knew that no one else had 4 turkeys, but I'd taken it for granted that everybody else had at least 1, and I felt that some hideous mistake must have been made in the allocation of Christmas fowl when this Man Mountain had been overlooked.
I'll bring you a turkey, I said, if you tell me where you live.
I said you'd never carry it that far. Bring it down to me here now, and I'll sling it over me shoulder.
I'll go home for one now, I said.
Don't forget, said the man without a Christmas dinner.
I won't.
And I didn't. The policeman put me down as a 7-year-old liar and began to pace his beat again. I went home to steal a turkey. I had a moment of panic when I was alone in the mortuary with the 4 swinging corpses, but I managed to lift one of them by its linked, scaly feet and its horrible, floppy neck. The feel of the cold, slimy flesh made me think of an octopus at the bottom of a dark pool, but I didn't turn back. I thought of the poor, hungry policeman, and I went on with the burglary. Even at its loneliest, ours was a crowded house, but as luck, good or ill, would have it, no one saw me stagger out from under the stairs with my arms full of Christmas dinner. No one heard me open the front door. No one saw me slink out on my Burke and Hare errand. And once I was out, I was as safe as houses. I was only a small boy carrying a big turkey. Nobody noticed me. That is, nobody except the policeman. But the policeman made up for all the rest. He rocked unbelievingly on his great heels. He raised his mighty arms to heaven, and he cried, "Glory be to God!" I thought at the time that he was giving thanks for a good dinner, but looking back at it now, I see that he was merely making the response proper to one who was committed professionally to the preservation of peace and goodwill. "Glory be to God!" That was all he said, and having said it, he took me in one hand and the turkey in the other and prepared to make restitution. We walked up the street together, the quick and the dead, boy, policeman, turkey. It turned out to be a most exciting journey, for we made a sort of walking intelligence test that most of the passers-by failed to pass. I had stolen a turkey. The policeman was bringing me to the lockup. We were the law, the culprit, and the evidence. When a procession of this kind appears in the streets, the sympathy of the crowd is usually with the prisoner, and on this occasion it certainly was with me. My youth, the enormous bulk of my escort, and the spirit of Dickens were factors that weighed heavily in my favour, and we soon attracted a biased and pitying audience. There was even a strong possibility of riot and civil commotion. A drunk man made a half-hearted attempt to rescue me, and a woman with a shawl shouted, "Don't be too hard on him, Constable. Sure, it's Christmas time." And when this appeal failed, she said, "You have a lot to do, arresting children, you big puddin' you. Why don't you hit your match?" Things were a little quieter when we got off the main street, but a fair-sized crowd followed us to the very door. The constable had a lot to say then. He had to charge me with forcible entry, burglary, the possession of stolen goods, and attempting to bribe a uniformed officer. He had a lot to say, but all he did say, when my mother opened the door, was, "Well, glory be to God, ma'am." He was a very pious constable. When the situation had been explained, the constable carried the turkey down through the hall. I can still hear the crunch of the snow between his heels and the lino, and he hung it once more on its nail under the stairs. Then he took off his helmet, cooled his forehead with his sleeve, and said, "Could you ever be up to them?" He was so deeply moved that we sat him down at the kitchen table and we gave him a finger of whiskey. After his strenuous evening, he deserved no less. Dear Santa, as one hypocrite to another, greetings and good wishes. The thing is done. I have stored away, against the vigil of the feast, a great rustling of brown paper parcels. So you may set your mind at ease about my loyalty. I am still prepared, provided that the cost of living does not balloon out of my reach, to act as your local representative and depot superintendent until such time as my illustrious virtues discover my duplicity. And even now, I must tell you, they have their doubts. This year, as every year, there has been a mild outbreak of that old heresy that occurs with the regularity of measles. But I've scotched it with the traditional specific, and the threat of empty stockings has worked again. Our house is sound, and though there have been a few defections in the neighbourhood, they're not worth worrying about. New clients are plentiful in prams and cradles, and they will more than make up for a wastage that must be regarded as inevitable. We have maintained our position, and I think that the directors should have no hesitation in declaring the usual dividend. But there is a much more serious heresy in the air, and it has so many voices and so many shapes, like the dark prince who is its perennial source, that we who gave up believing in you years ago, but can never give up believing in what you stand for, are sometimes half afraid to read the headlines. Once, and not so long ago, Europe, at this blessed time of year, was a blaze of lighted church windows. Carols meant more than carousels, and red symbolic candles shone out from 1,000,000 sills to guide your landings. But the lights grow fewer every year, and a great darkness is spreading over the face of Christendom. You were always a legend, Santa, but now they're trying to make you a lie, and you were never a lie. You were, rather, a logical necessity. You just had to be invented. You stand not just for a parable, but for a whole medley of parables. You represent, for example, the belief that prayers are heard and answered, the belief that time and space do not exist in the spiritual dimension, the belief that there is a bounty that is not embarrassed or diminished by the number of its clients or the immensity of their needs. You are only a fairy story, and that's why you've lasted so long. Had you ever been as real as Charlemagne, you would now be as dim and shadowy as Hannibal. You have lived because you have in you the deathless stuff of the best fairy stories. For the best fairy stories are all variants of the story that Adam heard at the gate of Eden, and that was no fairy story. The meaning and message of fairy stories is that all things come right in the end, that Michael's sword is still drawn, and that everyone who keeps the rules and does his best has a guarantee that he will live happily ever after. And the stock plot of the fairy story is that the king's son often comes in disguise, which is the very way the king's son did come. I don't mind children not believing in you, for children must grow up, and when a child is ready for the truth, he's the better of hearing it. But he must be prepared for it. It mustn't be jumped on him too suddenly. It's not easy to explain to a child that Bethlehem is not just a place or a time, but a continuing gift that reaches out to all times and all places. The truth must be softened and made easy, and that's where you come in. That is why the traditional way of rearing a Christian is to start him on Santa Claus. One of the things that puzzle many modern Santa is that you didn't die a natural death when Columbus discovered America or when Harvey discovered the circulation of the blood. They talk about the persistence of the legend, and they put it down to sentiment. They even talk of abolishing you and say that children should be told the truth. But have no fear. Abolishing you, you hoary old pretender, would mean abolishing the theology that is at the back of you, and would leave us with nothing but lies to tell our children. It would be quite easy to ban you from hoardings and shop fronts, to bar you from cards and calendars, but you are not just 10 million pictures, nor yet 10,000 men hired to wear red gowns and white beards during the Christmas rush. You are part of the tradition that is Bethlehem and Calvary. You are the cry of the prophets of old. You are a footnote to the fairy tale that came true. You are protected by the most comforting of all promises. No darkness can ever blot you out or prevail finally against the things you stand for. And nothing is surer than that the spatter of Christmas lights that once pinpointed Europe from Tagus to Volga will come again in God's good time. And that is why I am still prepared, in spite of the cost of living, to act as your local representative and depot superintendent until my illustrious virtues find both of us out. Why I am prepared to perpetuate a legend that looks like a lie, but is merely a cloak for the truth. Why I can say, literally and with all reverence, that the tiny things I have wrapped in brown paper and hidden away against the vigil of the feast are part of the deposit of faith. But sure, who am I telling it to? On a bright Sunday afternoon recently, when I was walking on the outskirts of the city, a very pleasant little lady, who was acting as spokeswoman for two still smaller ladies, asked me, with a mixture of respect and dignity, if I could tell her the right time. But the look on her face showed that she had no doubts at all on the matter. She knew that I could tell her the right time. I may feel young and think that I look young, but the young themselves are not deceived. They have given me institutional status. I am bracketed now with Trinity College and the Custom House and all other grey and venerable foundations. Incidentally, I've often wondered why so many of our public buildings should carry their clocks of all places on their foreheads, where they are of no use whatever to those who work within, just as my watch would be little help to me if I wore it face foremost on the front of my hat. And I have wondered also why, with so many wayside pulpits telling the time, no two of them should tell the same time. Can it be that the City Hall wants to have all the medical students late for lectures, that the university wants to produce chaos in the rates department, and that the stock exchange is bent on ending all punctuality in the National Library? Be that as it may, the point that matters is that with every city full of mechanical liars, and the truth not to be found even on church steeples, it is right and proper that respectable burghers should carry the gospel in their waistcoat pockets, or strapped to their wrists, and be ready to preach it on demand. But this is not the reason why young people are forever asking the right time. For young people are not interested in the sort of truth that we oldsters carry about with us. They listen to the gospel and ask to have it preached to them, but they look on the preachers as false prophets. They regard time as a sort of crooked adult arithmetic that works always to their own disadvantage, that puts an eternity between birthdays, makes school hours unbearably long, and stops the day's fun when it is at its brightest and best. And the little lady who stopped me so primly the other evening didn't want to know the time. She wanted something more magical than information. She wanted power. She wanted to try out an open sesame with me as the slave of the lamp. She wanted to prove a fairy story and test a recipe, and she did. She forced a stranger to a halt in his tracks. She made a grown-up stand and deliver. I had no defense against her ancient formula. I opened my overcoat, I opened my undercoat, I opened my watch, and I opened my mouth, and all at the behest of a damsel not much taller than a card table. You may think that in catching me she hadn't made much of a catch, but it might just as easily have been the Lord Mayor or the President of the High Court. She didn't ask me for the time, she asked me for the right time, as if to pretend that other people walking on the rim of the city that bright evening might be content with the wrong time, that certain giddy and irresponsible souls might be fobbed off with the approximate time, but that important people, like herself and myself, were interested only in the right time. Her attitude hinted at enterprises of great moment that might go awry if she were a couple of seconds out, one way or another. She wanted the right time or nothing. She wanted to know the right time, and I was obviously the right man to tell her. It was plain that she regarded me as a solid man in a world of featherheads. I got the impression that dozens of other men had told her the wrong time, and that she regarded me as her only hope. But in answering her, I lied as blatantly as the highest clock in the city. For I hadn't got the right time, and I'll never have it again. The right time is not rationed in hours and minutes, not prisoned in jeweled movements. It isn't that kind of time at all. The right time begins with your first doll or your first circus, and it lasts through the whole eternity of youth. It doesn't end like a committee meeting or a lecture. It fades like a sunset. Little by little, it becomes blurred and dim, and then you don't see it any longer. You never see it again, but once in a while you think that you do. It haunts you like a mirage, especially on bright evenings when the pinpoint buds are swelling. But the vision fades almost as soon as it comes, and you know then that you've no time left, but the kind that ticks respectably in vest pockets, the time that measures worries and working days and the interest on overdrafts. I could have said all of this to the little lady, who wouldn't have understood any of it. Gather Ye Rosebuds is addressed to young people, but no one understands it until he's old enough to read it in the past tense. So I preached no sermons. I left priggishness to the wayside pulpits, to the clocks on town halls and bank lintels and church steeples, to the brass tongues that waken every 15 minutes to remind us that old time is still a-flying. I simply consulted my half-hunter. It doesn't do just to look at it. You must pretend that you are having a conversation with it. I looked as wise and benevolent as I could, and I said, "It is exactly 20 minutes to 6. 20 to 6 will satisfy adults, but children feel cheated if you give them anything less than a complete sentence. It's always well, too, to throw in exactly for good measure, although precisely is even better." The spokeswoman thanked me gravely, and then, turning to the other members of the deputation, she said accusingly, "Now!" It was both an admonition and an exhortation. It meant, "I told you so," and it meant 50 other things just as frightening. It hinted at the eternity that had passed since dinner time, and of mighty undertakings still to be carried out before their hair was set in curlers for the night. There are few things more restful than watching an expert drinking a pint. But there are one or two conditions. He must be a man who drinks regularly, but never to excess. There must be no hurry on him, and he must be drinking alone. The very manner of his entrance is soothing. It sets him apart, and although he mutters something to the man behind the bar, he has no need to mutter, for the man behind the bar knows a pint man when he sees one. It's not a matter of dress, or age, or social status. It's a sort of spiritual look. The barman fills the tumbler slowly, taking black stuff from several taps, and builds up a head worthy of the body. Then he sets the offering down. He doesn't slam it down, or plank it down. He sets it down. The tempo was right from the very beginning. But he doesn't set it in the right place, for in spite of his years of practice, he doesn't know the right place. After all, he's only a general practitioner, and this is a specialist job. So the pint man takes up the tumbler with ritualistic care and moves it a little further along the counter. For a second or two, he looks at it objectively and without desire. Then he looks away from it, forgets it, falls asleep. And still asleep, he puts a match to his pipe and he takes a few sacrificial pulls. Nothing can touch him then. The clock ticks for you and for me, but the pint man is on an island in time. He is no longer old or young, rich or poor, married or single. He is beyond the numbing grip of circumstance, a devotee at a solemn rite, a poet with unfrenzied eye. He is a man with a pint. Presently, if you have time to spare and can keep awake, for there is a restful, mesmeric quality about the whole business, presently you will see him come out of his holy trance in slow stages. First, a tiny tremor runs through him, and he becomes aware of the tumbler. But it's only a tiny awareness. It might be any tumbler, and it is somewhere in the middle distance. When his mind begins to work again, and the picture comes into proper focus, he looks at the pint disinterestedly, almost reproachfully, and he turns away from it, like a contemplative dealing with a minor distraction. But even as he turns, his right hand, that ungodly and rebellious member, reaches out for the tumbler and finds it by sheer tactual memory. Then the arm joins the conspiracy, and the glass rises 5 or 6 inches from the counter. The pint man doesn't know how it got there, and has obviously forgotten how to deal with such a situation. But his lips remember, and his mouth, turning traitor, comes down to meet the tumbler. He doesn't tilt the glass very much, and he doesn't need to. It remains almost perpendicular, but the black stuff seems to flow out of it and into him of its own volition, breaking the law of gravity in some occult siphoning. When his eye meets yours across the top of the tumbler, it is still calm and remote. There is no urgency in him, and from the theological point of view, it's debatable whether or not there is full consent. The only sign of ecstasy you can detect in him is a slight commotion about his Adam's apple. And it is very slight, for he can open his throat like a tenor. There is no tension, no resistance, no strain. When the glass is 3/4 empty, the fraction varies a little with the performer. Some virtuosos raise it to 13/16. He sets it down on the counter again, and he wipes his mouth. But there is no gloating. These are simply reflex actions carried out by the unregenerate right hand, which does not seem to be under the direct control of the will. The pint man comes to life then, blinks a few times, shrugs the shoulder, changes the stance, fills his pipe, puffs as if he meant it. The spell is broken. You can talk to him now, and he will answer, for he's back in the world of men. He's interested in politics and prices, and he has opinions about the weather. And you must make the most of him while you have him, but you won't have him for long. He is simply resting between two periods of deep contemplation. Very soon the glazed look comes back into his eyes, and you know that he's on the verge of another bout of dynamic relaxation. He knows it himself, too, and just before he loses consciousness, he finishes his first pint and orders a second. And this time, he doesn't even mutter. He just nods. The barman, moving on tiptoe, sets down the second pint in almost the right place. But almost is not good enough for your pint man. And before he slips off again into the world of dreams, he sets the stage for his reawakening. His flight from reality is so smooth and so sudden that it almost brings you with it. The clock slows down, and a great peace flows over you. So before it engulfs you completely, you finish your bottle of stout, and you steal out into the night. The buses seem noisier than ever, and the street lights are brighter. You're back again in the world of everyday things, with its little kindnesses and cruelties, its hopes and fears. But you're ready for it as never before. You feel as refreshed as if you'd just come from a music recital or finished a great poem. For you have seen an artist at work, and you feel the better of it. It may happen some fine day that you'll be asked to dress the baby, so you might as well learn how it's done. First of all, you must catch your baby. Having located him in the wardrobe or under the bed, you lure him into the open by promising bic-bics. Then you place him face downwards across your knees, and you clutch him firmly with both hands. With your other two hands, you draw his nightdress up as far as his head. Since you haven't opened the buttons, it won't go any further. Next, you open the buttons and draw the nightdress up again. This time it will go right over his head and stifle his howls. Be careful, of course, not to stifle the baby. When the nightdress comes off, you'll find that you've lost control of the baby for the time being, so you must catch him again. This should be done, if possible, before he reaches the floor. Now we're ready to make a start. Take the first of the foundation garments and slip it twice over the baby's head. Once before you remember to open the buttons, and once for keeps. He will do his best to keep you from slipping his arms through the armholes, and indeed will try to make new armholes where only small tears exist at the moment. So you must, at this stage, be brusque, brisk, and brutal. Next, you refasten the buttons, a job which is about as easy as putting in dress studs when you have boxing gloves on, but if you stick at it, you'll manage it after a while. The only real danger is that while you're occupied with the buttons, the baby may fall from your knees. If he does, you simply replace him and sing at the top of your voice. If you cannot sing, keep your hand over his mouth. Practically the same technique is used with the 5 other woolly vests, the 6 bodices, and the 3 jerseys, which protect the infant from the icy blast, except that the further you get from the skin, the less scrupulous you get about the buttons. The trickiest part of the whole business is the adjusting of the one garment which does not go on over the baby's head. This essential and serviette-like covering, suitably folded, is attached to 4 of the woolly vests with 2 enormous safety pins. At the first attempt, you'll probably attach it to the baby, but if you don't draw blood, the slip may never be noticed, except, of course, by the baby. You must be careful, however, not to attach it to your own person, because adults are much more sensitive to pain. When you've got on the baby's clothes, you proceed, if you are still capable of muscular coordination, to put on his socks. Some authorities recommend you put the baby on his back during this operation, but if you do, you should be careful, because although a baby is only a baby, a kick in the mouth is still a kick in the mouth. A better way is to grip the child, still in your lap, with your elbows and stomach, and lodge one of his ankles between your tensed knees. This renders him comparatively helpless and leaves you free to give all your attention to the sock. There is not much bother in putting on one sock, or even in putting the 2 socks on. The whole bother is keeping them on. While you are drawing the second sock into position, the owner is pulling off the first. And by the time you get the first one on again, you will find him chewing the second. This clash of wills might go on interminably, but after a decent interval, you tether the baby to the leg of the bed with your necktie, and you make a short speech from the landing. Does anyone in the house realize that you have a job to go to? Will someone please come upstairs and finish off the baby? Of course, this isn't what you mean at all. You only want someone to finish his dressing. Then you go into the bathroom and you cut yourself shaving. If this was his first day at school, ma'am, I know how you feel. He was getting to be a bit of a nuisance in the house this last while, catching his finger in the wringer, turning on the gas jets, chasing the cat, running blindly across the road. And after every fresh bit of devilment, you told yourself, as a promise, and him as a threat, that you'd pack him off to school after the holidays. And you did. You dressed him up in his new jersey and pants, and you spent most of the morning grooming him. You almost washed his ears away, and you put a shine on his cheeks. You wet his curls and combed them into glory. You hugged him because he looked so lovely, and you cursed all schools because he looked so young. But you brought him, nevertheless, and you changed your child into a unit of attendance. You told them his name and his age. You wanted to tell them a lot of other things, that he's only an infant, really, that some of his discarded wrappings are still in use as dusters, that he responds to praise and affection, that you can get him to do anything you want if you take him the right way. But you didn't tell them any of these things. You were very brave and very reticent and utterly miserable. If you were a foolish woman, you would have offered to let your house go to pot and stay with him all day as an unpaid, untrained supernumerary, a highly privileged assistant. But you're a sensible woman, so you turned on your heel and walked away. Not too sensible, however, for you took one look back as you walked up the corridor, and you saw that he was looking back too, with a little lost look, as he went into the classroom to join his regiment. Something happened to your heart then. You told the woman next door over the railings that you didn't know whether you were laughing or crying, but you knew well enough, and she knew. You were crying, and you had good reason, for the thing that happened to your heart when you left him will never be put wholly right. You went in after that and made yourself a nice cup of tea, and when that failed, you tried a wild orgy of housework. But it was no good. It was a long, long morning, and the house was empty without him. You missed the shouts of him, and the frightening silence that made you drop everything and ask yourself, I wonder what he's up to now. You remember the days when, after a bump and a scream, he would come to you for comforting, and with alternate scolding and cuddling, you would ease his hurt, and your own. You had a baby in the cradle and a dinner on the range, but they didn't seem to take up as much of your time as usual. A weaker woman might have stood at the window at midday to watch for his coming, but you contented yourself with settling the front room curtains 5 or 6 times, and it was quite by accident that you saw him turn the corner. You wanted to rush down the road to meet him, so you went into the kitchen and stirred all the pots, just to show your self-control. But you didn't deceive even yourself, for your hand was shaking, and it wasn't the steam that made you dry your eyes. There wasn't the slightest hurry on him as he walked up the path, the little rascal, and when he came in, he fought free of your caresses. You wanted to know how he got on at school and what the mistress had said to him. You wanted to know if she'd noticed his nice new jersey and the near gold of his hair. You wanted to know if she'd given thanks publicly for the bonniest new scholar that ever sat in a desk. All he wanted was his dinner. He might have been years at school for all the excitement he showed, and the little he had to tell had to be dragged out of him. The mistress had drawn a cat on the board, and the master had a green bicycle. You asked him again and again what the mistress had said to him, and at last, with his mouth full of bread pudding, he remembered. What she'd said was, "Sit down there in that desk beside Johnny Sullivan." That's all. Before he had finished his second helping of pudding, there was a rattle at the letterbox, and he rushed out at once to join his comrades in arms. You dragged him back to rub his face and hands, and you terraced his curls with a wet comb. But all the time he was fighting to be gone, and when he walked out the gate with the others, he didn't as much as look back. You knew then that he was reared and done for, and when you went back into the kitchen again, the baby in the chair was no comfort to you. So you made yourself a nice cup of tea, and you told yourself not to be silly. After all, it was only for a few short hours. When he came back again in the evening, he would be your very own, and you would have him all to yourself. It was then that you cried in real earnest, for you knew in your heart and soul that you would never have him again. Not in the old way. He was reared and done for. You thought when you got him first that you would have him forever, but all you had was a loan of him. He will still come to you in his troubles, for he is tethered to your heart, but he will come less frequently as the tether lengthens, until some day it breaks and there is nothing left but the stake. You will still have him morning and evening, and on Sundays and holidays, but though he will return as surely as a homing pigeon, you will know that he is merely home on leave. From now on, the world will be his barrack square, and there is nothing you can do about it. And, ma'am, I know how you feel.
Almost every periodical that runs to a Christmas number, and the only ones that don't are the telephone directory and the summer bus guide, gets a member of the staff to dig up and modernise, or has foisted on it by an outside contributor, that traditional standby of the double number, hints for your Christmas party. And for the life of me, I can't see why. Because except in prisons, big hotels and the sergeant's mess, there is no such thing as a Christmas party. The Christmas party was invented by Dickens, and eagerly adopted by modern writers of crime stories who have to have some way of getting a herd of suspects together under one roof. I resent the suggestion that one cannot face Christmas properly without a collection of puzzles, games, and mathematical posers. I regard it as an affront to the tradition of near gluttony and indolence that marks Christmas in respectable middle-class homes that can't afford it. But the most degrading feature of these unnecessary hints for non-existent parties is the batch of illustrations that goes with it. The main idea in the artist's mind is that a person in a paper hat is necessarily enjoying himself, which is a gross exaggeration. A young man in a paper hat that leaves his curls showing may be enjoying himself. A young girl in a paper hat that suits her, which is the only kind of paper hat that a young girl will wear, is almost certainly enjoying herself. But a middle-aged man in a paper hat that makes him look repulsive, which is the only kind of paper hat made, is already comatose. If he weren't, he wouldn't permit this indignity to his face. At the paper hat stage of the Christmas dinner, I can pull a cracker as well or as badly as any man of my age. I pull with the ponderous insensibility of an elephant dragging a log out of a swamp. I pull without hilarity, almost without emotion, and I know what's coming. The other party to the contract may get a hat that will show off his curls, or be kind to the tilt of her nose, but I am doomed from the start. I get a hat that splits on my skull and makes me look like Crippen, Jack the Ripper, or the last days of Henry VIII. But I don't care. At that stage of the Christmas dinner, I am past caring. I am replete. I am as relaxed as an ox after a long day in deep pasture. If you took a photograph of me and my paper hat, you could give it any title you like, from Freak Potato to curious cloud formation on Mount Everest. A middle-aged man in a Christmas paper hat is fit only to move from the table, evict his eldest son from the armchair, and reflect on the annual problem of how to doze off without either letting his cigar go out or setting fire to his paper hat. He grunts when he's offered fruit. He grunts when he's asked to put coal on the fire. He grunts when somebody suggests a cup of tea. And he grunts when the children run across his toes. But, and make no mistake about this, he is not bored. His spirit is not broken. He is still head of the household. He is a very Christian gentleman, taking his rest and enjoying himself in the great old European tradition. He may seem half asleep, he may seem wholly asleep, but he is still in control of his faculties. And you can prove it by asking him to join in any of the imbecilities of the magazine-type Christmas party, to take 2 matches from 12 and leave 13, or get a penny from under a tumbler without touching the tumbler, or choose any card from the pack. He may be wearing a paper hat, he may be looking like a fried egg, but he is not to be trifled with. Admittedly, he won't answer you in words, because he is beyond words, but he will answer you. He will rise from his chair in slow installments. He will look at you like a wounded lion from beneath the eaves of his torn paper hat. And he will then go, majestically, upstairs, to bed. I overheard a man discussing cures for the common cold the other day, and he summed it all up by saying, yeah, sure, there's nothing to beat the old ball of malt all the same. And as I listened, I couldn't help thinking how hard it would be to explain his full meaning to a foreigner. A ball of malt, of course, is a glass of whiskey, but owl is untranslatable. When a man in Dublin says, "Soon be time to run the old overcoat again," he doesn't mean that your overcoat is old, or that his own overcoat is old. He means a whole host of things, that there's comfort in an overcoat, that overcoats have the backing of tradition, that we won't feel it till Christmas, and that time flies and death approacheth. Owl can mean a lot of things, but it rarely means old. And even when it does mean old, it means a dozen other things as well. Indeed, it's applied to new things much oftener than to old things. Thus, if you praise a friend's brand new bicycle, he will say, like as not, yeah, there's nothing like an old bike for getting you round, like, you know. This owl is Gaelic courtesy, and it's half affection, half disparagement. A very useful word indeed in a country where it's bad manners to acquiesce in the praise of your own. If you want to borrow something, owl is almost indispensable. It takes from the shame of asking. A man who has the language from the cradle, for example, will never ask you baldly for the loan of a wheelbarrow. He will look over your fence for a full hour, he'll smoke several pipes, and he'll finish up by saying, as a sort of afterthought, I don't suppose you'd have such a thing around the place as an old barrow you wouldn't be wanting for a little while, huh? He turns his question into a disinterested, negative statement. He simply refers to what he obviously considers a very remote possibility, and he leaves the rest to you. Similarly, if he wants to earth up his potatoes, he will refer obliquely, after a decent interval, to the possible existence of an owl shovel. And then, with a benign objectivity, he'll reveal the fact that he has a few owl spuds to earth up. Owl has 1,000 uses and as many tonal inflections, but you won't find them in the dictionary. You must learn them by experience and by listening to the best speakers. In backbiting and detraction, for example, a well-placed owl may strengthen the libel and put salt in the wound. But not always. Sometimes it softens the charge and brings a smile into it. A ruffian is only a ruffian, but an owl ruffian is usually a character around whom a whole saga of disreputable stories has grown up and in whom the entire neighbourhood takes pride. Again, an owl divil may be a decent owl fellow in his own way, but an owl blackguard is beyond redemption. To ask, how is the rheumatism, is one thing, but you're on an altogether different footing with someone to whom you can say, how is the owl rheumatism? The first question, you see, is cold and formal. The second is warm and intimate. So a stranger will tell you that he has a touch of lumbago, but the man you play snooker with will say, the owl back gives him an odd owl dart. This means that he has no grudge against his back, that he doesn't expect it will ever be much better, and that he's not worrying over much.
Or he may say simply, I have an owl back that follows me, as if the back were a mild family curse that no one can do anything about and that shows he comes from decent stock. I could give you 1,000 examples, but the secret would still be a secret, because unless you're born to the idiom, you will never master it. And every time you feel you're making a little headway, you'll come up against some fresh use of owl that will make you despair. Thus, a young man who talks too much is an owl blether, while a really old man may be an owl cod, and a child just learning to walk is an owl doze. You see, it's not just a difficult language, it's impossible. When I was growing up in Dublin, a boy would speak of his father as meowfla, an expression which hid varying amounts of tenderness, fear, respect, affection, resentment, and conditional loyalty. An owl one was an old woman, but a particular kind of old woman, respectable but not too respectable, fluent always, belligerent occasionally, partial to black shiny capes and black feathered hats, rather like a pantomime dame in appearance, and when roused, almost as ebullient. There were two kinds of poor owl one in Dublin. The first was an owl one in distress, an owl one being ejected from a public house, an owl one being arrested. The second was simply a poor old woman. Owl can be full of tenderness and sentiment. It can tell a love story or a life story. One snowy evening many years ago, I walked down a city street behind two aging men who were coming home from work. They walked in silence, and the snow deadened all our footsteps. And just before they separated, one of them said, "Dowell Mott is not too well." There was no reply. Each of them went his own way, and I was left to the silence of the snow. And for once, I couldn't translate. One man said that his wife was not well, but he said a lot more than that. He hinted that she'd never be better again. He linked the past with the present. He went back to his courtship days, and he echoed an "I will" that was 40 years old. We Irish are supposed to wear our hearts on our sleeves, but we don't, you know. We're terribly afraid of our hearts, and the old Gaelic reticence is still strong in us. We hide our deepest feelings, and we give our emotions no words. We can coin mighty compliments when we speak from the head, but when we speak from the heart, we are tongue-tied. However, we manage to get along because we have one little word that sees us through all our emotional difficulties. And it's a fine standby when the old tongue lets you down, like. You know.